The war did not go global when the missiles flew. It went global when shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the passage between Iran and Oman that carries around 1/5 of the oil the world consumes, and huge volumes of gas, ground to a near halt. That was the moment this stopped being a Middle East battle and started becoming a pressure point under the entire global economy. Then the threat got colder. Tehran began discussing a protocol with Oman that would require ships to obtain permits and licenses, which means the danger was no longer only that the route could be hit. The danger was that one of the most important sea lanes on Earth could start operating like a political checkpoint. And this is why that should scare people far beyond the Gulf. In 2024, 20 million barrels per day moved through this strait, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. So this is not just a shipping story. This is what it looks like when one war suddenly gets its hands around the wiring of global energy. If you can already feel where this is going, subscribe now, because this channel follows the pressure beneath the headline, not the headline itself. And tell me in the comments what you think the real turning point was. The strikes, or the moment passage itself started looking political. Here is the trap in one line. Iran cannot squeeze Hormuz without hurting itself, but it may still gain leverage by making everybody else hurt faster. The US and Israel can damage Iran, but if they cannot make the route feel normal again, then military success and strategic success are no longer the same thing. That is why this title is bigger than oil prices. The Hormuz trap is going global, means more than panic in commodity markets. It means every actor in this story is being forced into choices that get more expensive the longer the war goes on. And many of those actors are not even on the battlefield. That is why governments stopped speaking in vague language and moved to the phrase that matters most: de facto closure. They condemned attacks on commercial vessels, attacks on oil and gas infrastructure, and what they described as the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian forces, which tells you this was no longer just about volatility. It was about whether a global passage had already been weaponized. But the information war starts right there, because one side hears closure and imagines a total naval seal. The other side understands that full closure is not even necessary if insurers panic. Crews fear the crossing, ships delay sailings, and governments start preparing for selective access instead of free transit. That is what makes this story so dangerous. Even with claims that Iran's navy has been destroyed, the Strait of Hormuz still remains functionally closed, which means classic military dominance is no longer the whole game. The side that cannot control the sea in a clean naval sense can still control the psychology of passage. That is a much nastier kind of power. It does not need a steel gate across the water. It only needs enough danger, enough ambiguity, enough threat of mines, drones, missiles, or selective passage that commerce starts acting as if the gate is already there. And once that happens, the world is trapped in a new logic. Producers cannot export with confidence. Importers cannot plan with confidence. Markets cannot price normality with confidence. And every day that confidence stays broken, the war reaches further into countries that thought they were only watching from the outside. That is why the strategy here is so brutal. The logic being described is go for broke, a willingness to squeeze Iran's own economic lifeline, if that is what it takes, to choke the world's oil supply and force the outside world to feel the war in their own systems. Tehran does not need to look comfortable. It only needs to prove that everybody else becomes uncomfortable faster. That turns Hormuz into a trap for Iran. But not only for Iran. If Tehran escalates too far, it risks strangling itself. If Washington escalates harder, it risks widening exactly the global economic trauma it says it wants to contain. If Gulf states move openly to help break the pressure, they risk pulling more retaliation onto their own infrastructure. And then there is the rest of the world. Europe does not control the strait, but it can still be hit by tighter gas markets and higher transport costs. Asia does not decide the war, but it can still end up taking the first and hardest energy shock because so much Gulf supply moves east. This is what going global actually means: universal entanglement without equal control. The scale of that entanglement is huge. Roughly 27% of the world's seaborne crude oil and petroleum products trade and 22% of global LNG trade pass through this one waterway, which means the route is not just important. It is a structural weakness in the design of the modern energy economy, and exposed weaknesses do not go back to sleep. Once governments, traders, militaries, and major importers have watched one war put this much pressure on one corridor, they stop asking whether the route is technically open today. They start asking whether it is politically reliable tomorrow. That is the first real meaning of rewiring energy politics. It means policy starts moving before peace arrives. It means stockpiles, route diversity, supplier diversity, insurance risk, naval posture, industrial strategy, and even electrification begin to look different because the old assumption of neutral passage no longer feels safe. And now the story gets bigger than crude. In 2024, about 20% of global LNG trade transited Hormuz, primarily from Qatar, which means this war does not just threaten fuel for cars or planes. It reaches directly into electricity systems, industrial demand, heating supply, and the political stability of gas-dependent economies. That is why people who think this is only about oil are already behind the story. Oil shocks are dramatic and visible. Gas shocks are quieter at first, then suddenly they are in power prices, factory costs, storage decisions, and emergency government meetings. By the time the average viewer feels that kind of crisis, the strategic shift has already happened. Some countries can absorb that shock better than others. Some have more buffers, more domestic flexibility, or more alternative options. Others built prosperity on the belief that seaborne energy would keep moving through predictable lanes, under predictable rules, with predictable legal meaning. That belief now looks naive. That is why the response escalated to something extraordinary. A coordinated release of 400 million barrels of emergency oil stocks was authorized to answer major disruptions in oil markets, the largest such move ever. Which means governments were not treating this like another temporary scare. They were acting like the system itself had been hit. But emergency barrels buy time. They do not restore trust. They do not convince ship owners that a route feels normal again. And they do not erase the lesson that access to energy can now be contested long before a navy declares a formal blockade. That is where the energy politics really starts to rewire. States begin learning that resilience is not just about buying supply when you need it. It is about not being trapped into buying panic when somebody else decides passage has become conditional. In a world like that, infrastructure and security stop being separate conversations, and that changes who looks strong. A state that can root around a crisis, substitute supply, or survive a price shock suddenly has more room to maneuver than a state with bigger rhetoric but fewer buffers. A war in one corridor starts redistributing strategic confidence everywhere else. Then the blast radius gets wider still. High energy fertilizer and transport costs, including freight rates, bunker fuel, and insurance premiums, begin pushing food costs higher and intensifying cost of living pressure, especially for the most vulnerable. That is the moment this stops being an energy market story and becomes a social stability story. This is how one war gets into countries that never launched a strike. It travels through freight invoices, import bills, inflation reports, supermarket prices, and central bank headaches. It moves through the systems people depend on every day, until governments thousands of miles from the Gulf are suddenly reacting to a battlefield they do not control. And this is why the click promise and the title matters so much. One war is now rewiring energy politics, is not saying the war caused a bad week in oil. It is saying the war is changing how states think about the vulnerability, how they define security, and what they will spend money on next to avoid being exposed like this again. And fertilizer is where the hidden violence becomes impossible to ignore. More than 30% of global urea trade and about 20% of trade in ammonia and phosphate move through Hormuz, which means the shock does not stop at refineries or tank farms. It reaches planting seasons, crop prices, and eventually the politics of food. That is not a side effect. That is part of the trap. A choke point crisis in energy starts contaminating agriculture, shipping, and household budgets at the same time. By the time the damage looks global, it has already traveled through several layers of the real economy and attached itself to people who do not even follow Middle East maps. That is how a narrow passage becomes a global weapon. Not because it kills everyone at once, but because it forces everyone into the same chain reaction at different speeds. Some feel it at the port, some at the power plant, some at the factory gate, some at the checkout line, and some at the ballot box. And inside that chain reaction are real people trying to survive it in real time. More than 40 ships disabled their automatic identification system signals at the start of the conflict, the practice known as going dark, which means crews and operators were already acting as if they were moving through a coercive zone rather than a normal trade route. That is what civilian commerce looks like when a shipping lane starts behaving like a battlefield. That human detail matters because it kills the safe version of the story. This is not just an argument between capitals. This is mariners, crews, managers, insurers, and traders making survival decisions inside a space where identity, routing, timing, and visibility can suddenly become dangerous. And once ships are going dark, the old fiction of normal circulation is over. At that point, the route is no longer being judged by formal declarations. It is being judged by behavior. If commercial behavior says the corridor is unsafe, then the world begins pricing unsafe passage, whether politicians admit it or not. That is why one of the most revealing lines in this whole crisis is the idea of a new regime for the Strait of Hormuz following the war. If that ever hardens into policy, then passage itself becomes political infrastructure. And even if it never fully materializes, the threat alone is designed to force the world to negotiate around Iranian leverage long after the strikes slow down. This is the second meaning of the trap. Once the possibility of a post-war access regime is introduced, the world cannot unhear it. Importers start asking whether today's disruption is tomorrow's toll system. Producers start asking whether customers will now demand routes that bypass them. Governments start asking whether energy independence was a slogan when it should have been doctrine. And that is why the title says the trap is going global, not the shock. Shocks fade. Traps restructure behavior. Traps make every exit expensive. Traps force actors into moves they did not want to make. At times they did not choose, under pressure they cannot fully control. Iran is trapped because it may need the leverage, even though the leverage hurts its own lifeline. The US is trapped because every claim of restoring order gets judged against whether order actually returns to the strait. Gulf states are trapped because they need flows restored but do not want to become the next target and set. Importing economies are trapped because they cannot de-risk from this corridor overnight. That is why one simple phrase says more than pages of diplomacy. The Strait of Hormuz remains practically closed. Practically closed means the crisis has already crossed the threshold where semantics stop mattering to the real economy. If passage is dangerous enough, delayed enough, politicized enough, and uncertain enough, then the system behaves as if closure is already real. So here is the answer to the question carrying this whole story. Did the war only disrupt energy markets? Or did it create a new world in which access to Hormuz itself becomes a political weapon? The answer is that the weaponization has already happened, because the world is already changing behavior around it. If Iran truly intends to turn Hormuz into a long-term permit, toll, or selective passage regime, then this war has opened the door to a new form of geopolitical taxation over global energy flows. If Iran is bluffing, the bluff still worked well enough to trigger emergency stock releases, route fear, freight stress, food risk spillover, and a permanent rethink of choke point exposure. Either way, the same strategic damage survives. That is the hard conclusion. The old energy order assumed circulation was normal until physically blocked. The new one is learning that circulation can be controlled priced, politicized, and psychologically frozen long before it is fully sealed. That changes the balance between producers and importers, between military force and economic coercion, and between short wars and long consequences. So if you clicked expecting another video about oil spiking because the Middle East is on fire, that was only the surface. The deeper layer is that one war just exposed how easily a sea lane can become leverage. Leverage can become inflation. Inflation can become political stress. And political stress can start redrawing the global energy map. And that is the line I want left in your head when this ends. The most dangerous weapon in this war may not be the one that destroys the infrastructure. It may be the one that decides whether the infrastructure still connects the world at all. Stay locked in here, because this channel follows the pressure after the blast, and that is where the future always leaks out first.